For months, the German High Command had been nursing a dangerous illusion that the United States, arrogant and inexperienced, could never field an army capable of challenging the Wehrmacht. In the corridors of power, this belief wasn't merely a thought, it was the foundation of their entire strategy. But a report, a document as precise as it was merciless, reached the hands of senior commanders in the spring of 1943, and it changed everything. It was a warning, a sentence, and a brutal reminder of a reality Germany had refused to see, that across the ocean, an awakened industrial nation was producing bombers, tanks, and ships at a pace that defied comprehension. What those numbers revealed wasn't just a miscalculation, but the certainty of inevitable defeat. And on that day, even Hitler understood he had underestimated the wrong enemy.
The German Mindset, 1942-1943. In the winter of 1942, confidence permeated the halls of German military headquarters. Despite setbacks in the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht's leadership maintained a conviction that would prove catastrophic. The United States posed no immediate industrial threat to the Third Reich. This wasn't baseless arrogance. Germany's military tradition stretched back centuries. Their officer corps represented generations of professional military education. Their industrial base had armed Europe's most formidable fighting force. The Blitzkrieg had shattered Poland, France, and the Low Countries in campaigns measured in weeks, not years. The United States, by contrast, appeared to be a nation of amateurs playing at war. Adolf Hitler himself reinforced this perception repeatedly. In private discussions with his generals, he characterized Americans as soft, undisciplined, and incapable of sustaining a prolonged military campaign. He pointed to their lackluster performance in World War I, where American forces had arrived late and in relatively small numbers. He cited their peacetime military, a fraction of Germany's size, as evidence of their unseriousness about warfare. A country that cannot even organize its own economy, Hitler remarked during one meeting at the Wolfschanze, cannot organize a modern war. The Führer's economic advisors presented figures showing that while American industrial capacity was indeed substantial, converting civilian production to military manufacturing would take years. By then, Germany would have consolidated its hold on continental Europe, secured the oil fields of the Caucasus, and achieved a position from which no amount of American production could dislodge them. This thinking wasn't confined to Hitler. Across the German command structure, officers who had witnessed the swift victories of 1939 to 1940 believed in German military superiority as an article of faith. The Luftwaffe had dominated European skies. Panzer divisions had revolutionized warfare. U-boats prowled the Atlantic with impunity. How could a nation that had barely maintained a standing army possibly threaten this military juggernaut? The propaganda machine. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, understood the power of perception. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, his ministry worked tirelessly to reinforce the image of American weakness. Newsreels shown in German theaters portrayed American soldiers as poorly trained and equipped. Radio broadcasts mocked Roosevelt's promises of military production as the delusions of a desperate president. Newspapers published editorial cartoons showing Uncle Sam stumbling under the weight of military equipment he couldn't properly use. The Americans know how to make automobiles and refrigerators, but they do not know how to make war. This messaging served multiple purposes. It maintained civilian morale in an increasingly difficult war. It justified the decision to declare war on the United States following Pearl Harbor. And perhaps most importantly, it shaped the strategic calculations of Germany's military leadership. If American military capability was limited, then Germany could afford to focus its resources on the Eastern Front. The massive industrial effort required to defeat the Soviet Union wouldn't leave Germany vulnerable in the West because there was no credible Western threat. The propaganda was so pervasive, so consistent, that it created an echo chamber within German military circles. Officers who might have questioned the wisdom of dismissing American industrial might found themselves isolated. The official position was clear. America was not a factor in German strategic planning. Early reports and dismissals. Yet even as propaganda painted America as a paper tiger, troubling reports began filtering through German intelligence channels. U-boat commanders operating in the Atlantic noted an increase in convoy activity during late 1942. These weren't the small, poorly defended merchant groups they'd been targeting earlier in the war. These were massive formations, sometimes 50 or more ships, protected by destroyers and escort carriers that demonstrated increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine tactics. Captain Leutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful U-boat aces, submitted a report in January 1943 describing a convoy he had observed from periscope depth. Ship after ship, stretching to the horizon, I counted 73 vessels before losing count. The escorts were everywhere. Destroyers, corvettes, even aircraft from what appeared to be a small carrier. We had no opportunity to attack. German naval intelligence received these reports, but interpreted them through the lens of existing assumptions. These large convoys represented desperate measures, the Americans and British scraping together everything they had for one major push. It couldn't be sustained. This dismissal occurred when analyzing aerial reconnaissance photographs of British airfields. Starting in mid-1942, these bases began filling with four-engine bombers of types previously unseen in Europe. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator appeared in increasing numbers. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers noted this buildup, but minimized its significance. American bomber crews were inexperienced. Their tactics were untested. German fighter pilots and anti-aircraft defenses would handle them just as they'd handled RAF bomber formations. What these analysts failed to grasp or refused to acknowledge was the rate of increase. In June 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force in England could barely muster a dozen bombers for a raid. By December, that number had grown to nearly 100. By March 1943, it exceeded 300. Someone in German intelligence was paying attention to these numbers. Someone was asking uncomfortable questions, and someone was compiling a report that would force the German High Command to confront a reality they'd been desperately avoiding. The origins of the report. The document that would shatter German illusions about American industrial capacity didn't emerge from a single source.
It represented a synthesis of intelligence gathered from multiple channels, painstakingly assembled by analysts in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the supreme command of the armed forces. These analysts had access to industrial espionage reports from neutral countries, particularly Sweden and Switzerland, where German intelligence operatives tracked American industrial developments. They reviewed economic data published in American newspapers and trade journals, information freely available in a democracy at war. They studied reports from German naval attachés in neutral ports who observed American ships and questioned merchant crews. Most critically, they compiled data from U-boat patrol reports. While individual submarine commanders might dismiss a single large convoy as an anomaly, the pattern that emerged when examining dozens of reports was undeniable. American merchant ship production was accelerating at an exponential rate. The task of synthesizing this information fell to a team of Wehrmacht economic warfare specialists. These weren't ideologues or party loyalists. They were professional analysts trained to assess enemy industrial capacity. Their job was to provide accurate intelligence, regardless of whether that intelligence aligned with leadership preferences. As they worked through the winter of 1942-1943, a picture emerged that defied their initial assumptions. The numbers they were seeing couldn't be reconciled with the official narrative about American industrial weakness. They double-checked their sources. They verified figures through multiple channels. They used conservative estimates whenever data was uncertain. And still, the conclusion remained inescapable. The United States was engaged in an industrial mobilization unprecedented in human history. The numbers. The report's findings were organized into several categories, each more alarming than the last. Aircraft production. German intelligence estimated that the United States had produced approximately 47,000 military aircraft in 1942. This figure alone exceeded Germany's total production for the same period. But the trajectory was even more concerning. Production was accelerating. By 1943, the U.S. was projected to build between 85,000 and 90,000 aircraft. The report noted specific models. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had increased from roughly 1,200 units in 1941 to over 6,000 in 1942, with capacity expanding further. Consolidated B-24 Liberator, a newer design ramping up even faster, with production facilities at multiple locations. Fighter aircraft, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings rolling off assembly lines in numbers that German fighter production couldn't match. What made these figures particularly devastating was the implication for strategic bombing. Each B-17 or B-24 could carry several tons of bombs to targets in Germany. If hundreds or thousands of these aircraft reached operational status in Europe, German industrial cities would face destruction on a scale the Reich couldn't counter. Naval construction. U.S. shipbuilding capacity represented perhaps the most shocking element of the report. Using data from maritime intelligence and neutral port observations, German analysts concluded that American shipyards were producing Liberty ships at a rate exceeding 3 per day, Essex-class fleet carriers at unprecedented speed, destroyers and destroyer escorts in numbers that would overwhelm German U-boat operations. The report specifically noted the Liberty ship program. Henry Kaiser's West Coast shipyards had revolutionized merchant vessel construction, reducing build time from months to weeks. the SS Robert E. Peary had been completed in just 4 days and 15 hours. A propaganda stunt, certainly, but one that demonstrated astonishing organizational capability. More concerning were the escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls specifically to provide air cover for Atlantic convoys. These vessels were appearing at roughly 2 per month, and they were proving devastatingly effective against U-boats.
Tank and vehicle production. American tank production in 1942 had reached approximately 24,000 units. This included M4 Sherman medium tanks, not as heavily armored as German Panthers or Tigers, but produced in quantities that made up for individual deficiencies. M3 Stuart light tanks, fast and reliable, being shipped to Allied forces worldwide. Specialized vehicles, tank destroyers, armored personnel carriers, and support vehicles in corresponding numbers. The report emphasized that American industrial planning included standardization and interchangeable parts, concepts that made maintenance and replacement far more efficient than German practices of custom engineering different models for different purposes. The critical projection. But the most chilling section of the report wasn't about current production. It was about future capacity. German analysts concluded that American industrial mobilization had not yet reached full capacity. Factories were still being converted from civilian to military production. New facilities were still being constructed. Workforce training programs were still expanding. The projection was stark. By late 1943 or 1944, American military production could triple from 1942 levels. This meant over 100,000 aircraft per year, thousands of tanks per month, merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them, an endless supply of ammunition, vehicles, and supplies. The report included a comparison that captured the disparity in a single devastating sentence. The United States possesses the industrial capacity to outproduce Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 2.3. Reaction among analysts. The men who compiled this report understood its implications before it was ever presented to senior leadership. In the offices of Wehrmacht intelligence, conversations took on a darker tone. These were professional military analysts trained to assess enemy capabilities objectively. They weren't defeatists or conspirators. They were simply people who could read numbers and understand what those numbers meant. One officer, reviewing the aircraft production figures, reportedly commented to a colleague, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory that happens to have an army attached to it." Another, examining the naval construction data, realized that Germany's U-boat campaign, the one weapon system that might have strangled Allied supply lines, was already mathematically doomed. U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, while American shipyards were producing escorts and merchant vessels faster than submarines could sink them. The arithmetic was merciless. There was fear in these realizations, but also a grim professional duty. This information had to reach the highest levels of command. Decisions were being made based on false assumptions about enemy capabilities. If German strategy didn't account for American industrial might, every plan, every operation, every sacrifice would be in vain. The report was formatted,
classified as top secret and prepared for distribution to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and ultimately to the Führer himself. In the quiet of those offices, before the report ascended the chain of command, some of these analysts understood they were documenting not just enemy capability, but German defeat. The numbers didn't lie. The trajectory was clear, and time, that most precious resource in war, was running out.
Presentation to the High Command. The briefing room at Führer headquarters was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. It was spring 1943, and senior Wehrmacht officers had gathered for what had been described as an urgent intelligence briefing on American industrial capacity. Field marshals and generals took their seats around the large table covered with maps. These were men who had planned the conquests of Poland and France, who had driven deep into the Soviet Union, who considered themselves masters of modern warfare. The officer presenting the report was a mid-level intelligence analyst, not a combat commander, not a decorated hero, but a man whose expertise was in numbers and industrial capacity. His presence at such a high-level briefing was itself unusual. He began methodically, outlining the sources and methodology behind the report. Some officers listened attentively. Others appeared skeptical before he'd reached the substantive findings. Then he began presenting the data. Aircraft production figures, naval construction rates, tank manufacturing capacity. Each number larger and more alarming than anticipated, each projection showing not just current production, but accelerating expansion. The room grew quieter as he progressed through the presentation. Officers who had been leafing through papers stopped. Conversations ceased. The only sound was the analyst's voice, steady and professional, delivering information that fundamentally challenged everything these men had believed about the war. When he reached the comparison that the United States could outproduce Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, several officers leaned back in their chairs. One shook his head slowly. Another lit a fresh cigarette, despite one already burning in the ashtray before him. 3.2. The Weight of Reality. The initial response was disbelief, though not universal. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, dismissed the figures as Allied propaganda. Impossible, he declared. No nation can produce aircraft at such rates. Our intelligence is being fed false information to demoralize us. Others weren't so quick to reject the analysis. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, had seen enough intelligence reports to recognize thorough work. He asked pointed questions about source verification and methodology. The answers satisfied him enough that he didn't dispute the findings. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood industrial capacity better than any military officer in the room. He had recently been appointed to rationalize German war production and had spent months analyzing Germany's own output. He knew exactly how much Germany could produce, and he could see that the American figures, if accurate, represented an insurmountable advantage. Even if we capture the entire Soviet industrial base, one general remarked quietly, we cannot match this. The statement hung in the air. It articulated what several in the room were beginning to realize. German strategy had been predicated on defeating enemies before American industrial might could be brought to bear. That window had closed. The weight of American production was already being felt in North Africa, where British and American forces were pushing back the Afrika Korps. It would soon be felt in Italy, and eventually, inevitably, in France. The Eastern Campaign against the Soviet Union, which had consumed enormous resources and hundreds of thousands of German lives, now appeared in a different light. Even if Germany somehow achieved victory in the East, it would emerge weakened and depleted, facing an opponent in the West that could simply overwhelm German defenses through sheer material superiority. Some officers argued for strategic responses: accelerate production of jet fighters, prioritize V-weapon development, make the cost of invasion so high that the Allies would negotiate. But these were tactical adjustments to a strategic problem. No innovation or defensive preparation could counter an opponent who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Adolf Hitler's reaction to the report came in stages. Initially, he rejected the figures outright. He accused intelligence officers of defeatism, of being taken in by enemy misinformation. He cited his own understanding of American character, their supposed softness, their lack of military tradition, as evidence that these production figures couldn't possibly be accurate. But as the briefing continued and more data was presented, Hitler's anger gave way to something more disturbing: silence. He studied the documents. He asked questions about specific figures. And slowly, the reality penetrated even his ideologically driven worldview. Hitler understood industrial capacity better than many of his generals gave him credit for. He had overseen Germany's own rearmament in the 1930s. He knew what factories could produce given proper organization and resources, and he could see, even through his prejudices, that the United States possessed industrial resources Germany could never match. One witness to the meeting later recounted Hitler standing before a map of the world, staring at the vast outline of the United States. No occupied territories to defend, no bombed factories to rebuild, no exhausted population, just an enormous industrial base protected by two oceans operating at full capacity with no impediment. "We are not fighting an army," Hitler reportedly said, echoing the intelligence analyst's earlier comment. "We are fighting a factory." It was perhaps the most clear-sighted assessment of Germany's strategic position he would ever make. But clarity didn't produce solutions. The fundamental problem remained. Germany had started a war it now lacked the resources to win. Every week that passed saw American strength grow, while German strength, despite local victories, declined in relative terms. The meeting ended with no dramatic decisions, no radical strategic shifts. What could be done? Surrender was ideologically impossible for the Nazi regime. Fighting on was mathematically futile. The report had illuminated a trap from which there was no escape. As officers filed out of the briefing room, the mood was somber. Some had arrived believing they were managing a difficult but winnable war. They left understanding they were managing an inevitable defeat. The only questions remaining were how long it would take and how much it would cost.
Strategic paralysis. In the months following the briefing, a subtle but profound shift occurred in German strategic planning. The aggressive confidence that had characterized earlier campaigns gave way to a more defensive, reactive posture. This wasn't a conscious decision so much as an emergent pattern. Officers who had once planned ambitious offensives now focused on consolidating positions. Resources were shifted toward defensive preparations. The language of victory gave way to talk of holding out and making the enemy pay. Field commanders on the Eastern Front noticed increased pressure to achieve decisive results before American power could be fully deployed in the West. The massive tank battle at Kursk in July 1943, Operation Citadel, represented Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. It was launched partly from the understanding that time was running out, that Germany needed to knock the Soviet Union out of the war before facing the full weight of Allied power from the West. The operation failed, consuming the armored reserves Germany would desperately need for defense. Meanwhile, Allied bombing of German industrial targets intensified. The very factories that needed to counter American production were being systematically destroyed. The 8th Air Force, which had numbered a few dozen bombers in 1942, now launched raids of several hundred aircraft, and those numbers would only grow. The numbers become reality. By autumn 1943, the projections in the intelligence report were becoming observable fact. The Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively against German U-boats. New Allied escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where submarines had previously operated with relative impunity. U-boat losses soared, while merchant ship construction accelerated. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine force, recognized that his campaign to strangle Allied supply lines had failed. In the Mediterranean, Allied forces invaded Sicily and then mainland Italy, forcing Germany to defend yet another front with resources it couldn't spare. American-built vehicles, weapons, and supplies poured into these operations in quantities that German defenders found overwhelming. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany intensified throughout 1943 and into 1944. American B-17s and B-24s joined RAF bombers in around-the-clock attacks on German cities and industrial facilities. The Luftwaffe, once masters of European skies, found itself outnumbered and outproduced. For every German fighter shot down, American factories produced 3 replacements. German pilots were among the best trained in the world, but training took time. Time Germany didn't have. American pilots might be less experienced, but they arrived in endless waves, flying aircraft that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. And looming over everything was the inevitable cross-channel invasion. German intelligence knew it was coming. They knew roughly where and when. But knowing and stopping it were different matters. The Americans and British were assembling an invasion force that would dwarf anything in military history. Supported by naval power Germany couldn't contest, and air superiority Germany couldn't challenge. By early 1944, even the most optimistic German planners understood the fundamental equation. Germany was fighting a war of attrition it couldn't win. The Soviet Union provided endless manpower. The United States provided endless material. Britain provided bases and coordination. Together, they formed a coalition that could absorb any losses Germany could inflict and return stronger. Germany's advantages, tactical skill, technological innovation, interior lines of defense, were real but insufficient. A well-commanded panzer division might defeat Allied counterparts in equal numbers, but those Allied counterparts would return with reinforcements, while the panzer division's losses remained permanent. German scientists developed superior weapons, the Panther tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, but couldn't produce them in quantities that mattered. Meanwhile, American factories churned out adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. The intelligence report from 1943 hadn't just predicted this situation, it had explained it with mathematical precision. Industrial capacity would determine the war's outcome, and Germany simply lacked the capacity to compete with American production. Some German officers recognized this earlier than others. Some never fully accepted it. But by D-Day, June 6, 1944, when thousands of Allied ships appeared off the coast of Normandy, when hundreds of bombers blackened the sky, when American, British, and Canadian troops poured ashore in numbers that made defense impossible, the arithmetic of defeat became impossible to deny. The report that had arrived at Wehrmacht headquarters in 1943 hadn't been a warning that could be heeded. It had been a diagnosis of a terminal condition. Germany had started a war against an opponent whose industrial resources it couldn't match, whose production it couldn't counter, whose material advantages would ultimately prove decisive. And perhaps the cruelest irony was that German intelligence had seen this coming, had documented it, had presented it to leadership, and there had been nothing anyone could do. The industrial disparity was too vast. The time needed to close the gap was too long. The war Germany was fighting in 1943 had already been lost in the economic decisions made years earlier.
Wars are often remembered for their battles, for the tactical brilliance of commanders, the courage of soldiers, the turning points where victory hung in balance. But World War II, more than perhaps any conflict in history, was decided by factors far from the battlefield. It was decided in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, where tanks and bombers rolled off assembly lines in numbers that defied German comprehension. It was decided in the shipyards of California and the Gulf Coast, where merchant vessels were launched faster than submarines could sink them. It was decided in the fundamental economic disparity between a continental industrial power and a resource-constrained aggressor already fighting on multiple fronts. The intelligence report that reached German High Command in 1943 didn't change Germany's strategic situation, it merely illuminated it. The outcome had been determined by decisions made years earlier, by economic realities that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Adolf Hitler had gambled on a short war, on defeating enemies before American industrial might could be mobilized. He had lost that gamble not at Stalingrad or Normandy, but in the fundamental miscalculation of his opponent's capabilities. The Wehrmacht's officers were professional soldiers, many of them brilliant tacticians. But they were fighting a type of war their training hadn't prepared them for, a war where industrial output mattered more than operational skill, where material advantages compounded over time, where the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't on the battlefield at all. The document that circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters in the spring of 1943 told a story not of military defeat, but of mathematical inevitability. And in that cold calculation, in those devastating production figures, lay the true turning point of the war. Germany's fate had been sealed not by any single battle, but by the awakening of an industrial giant that would not stop producing until the war was won. The intelligence report hadn't predicted defeat. It had simply made explicit what the numbers had been saying all along. The question was never whether Germany could win. It was only ever how long defeat would take and how much it would cost. And the numbers, merciless and precise, had already provided the answer.